G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Spark Your Fire. I should say, first episode of Spark Your Fire in 2026. Geez, I should make the introduction more interesting. Next time I'll get John to do it, which is always going to be an interesting one, right? So, Happy New Year, everyone. It's our first episode, and apologies for being absent. We were obviously working on our businesses and getting everything under control. But look, we are back now for more interesting contents this year. So it's good to have you back, John. Welcome
Good to
back.
be back. Happy New Year, David, and Happy New Year to our listeners. It's nice to be with all of you.
Absolutely. I think people are running out of options because they keep on listening what our 2026 predictions are. I think they've ended up to being the highest download rate out of it. They must be
Exactly.
craving for contents, John. So blame it on us, right? We should be giving them more, not less.
Got to give the people what they want. So let's deliver.
It's always like supply and demand, right? Which is what we're going to be touching on today as well, in
Mm.
terms of our main topics too. So, but look, first up, February, RBA has delivered a cash rate hike. So remember, last year we were talking about the general consensus was still a rate reduction. Just how quickly things have turned
Yeah.
around. It's amazing, I gotta say. So, um, and I'm sure everyone's fully aware what the reason is in terms of the rate hike. It's just because the CPI has been too high out of the quarter. Although I still don't necessarily agree to say that we really need a rate hike, but it sounds to me it's more like an insurance one for this one, because they are starting to see that the CPI is starting to get out of control again. Therefore, they want to put in a bit of insurance and they want to put in early, so that way it gives the board, the RBA board, a bit more confidence that the CPI is heading in the right direction, back into the 2 to 3% band. What does that mean for homeowners and investors? Unfortunately, your borrowing capacity is going to drop. I think everyone knows about that. For existing homeowners and property investors, your repayment's going to go up because of the 0.25% interest rate increases. Some of the banks are already passing on this week. As a matter of fact, I think today is Friday as we record it. And most of the banks will be passing on next week towards mid-February at the moment. A raise of them, most of them will be going up at that point in time. So you would have received notices on that. In terms of those prospective people looking at buying properties, whether that's owner occupier or investors, looking at a 0.25% increase. In fact, I think pretty much all lenders have passed on the 0.25 in full. So it's an increase, which means your borrowing capacity is going to drop. Depending on whether it's an owner occupier or investment, looking at maybe around 2% to 3% reduction in your borrowing capacity around that.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so just keep that in mind. Whatever pre-approval that you may have done earlier, now if we're looking to renew that, there is going to be a slightly drop in terms of your borrowing capacity. The more debts that you have, the more impact you have. Okay. So if you already got 10 properties with like 5 mil of debt, then this rate increase is going to hurt. It's going to dent your borrowing capacity more than those people who's only got one property and maybe a 500K mortgage. So just keep that in mind. But John, circling back to you, is this expected in your opinion once you saw the December quarter CPI data that came in? Do you think that, oh, that's a done deal? I know market's definitely priced in. It was about 75%. I think the market was pricing in the 75% probability for a February rate increase. Were
Yeah.
you kind of on the same boat at that point?
No, I thought they would hold, and take a bit more of a wait and see approach.
Mm,
There was a consensus right at the end that rates would go up, but that's only because the last CPI figure came out at, I think, 3.8% annualized. But until then, it was that rates might go up during the year, but for now they're going to hold. And then when the CPI data came in, even hotter than expected, only then did the consensus change.
okay.
I mean, yeah, I wasn't convinced it would happen, but it makes sense. I mean, if the RBA isn't there to extinguish the inflation that they themselves create, like a central bank in an economy is just an inflation machine. Like that's all they can control. Can't really control employment. And so if they've dialed the thermostat up too high, they need to dial it back down. And I was a little bit surprised because I think that there are headwinds, but they are right. Like inflation is what kills cultures and economies and people. So they're right to want to rein that in. So I've, so that they probably did the right thing to get on top of this. Um, just zooming out a little bit, uh, Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve, one of the longest, serving Federal Reserve chairmen, said that he looks at the gold price to tell him if he's loose or too tight. And and he used to say that if the gold price goes over $300 an ounce, he's being too loose with monetary policy. If it goes too far under $300 an ounce, he's being too tight. Now, gold prices in Australian dollar like $8,000 recently. So the RBA has been too loose for a couple of years now. And as much as I like low interest rates because I need to service my debts as well, from an economic perspective, they probably shouldn't have been cutting before, and they probably just need to normalize. And if the gold price is there to tell us anything, it's that a central bank is being too expansionary or alternatively too limiting. And with gold at like $8,000 an ounce, it's come back a little bit now. They were obviously too loose, so it's probably the right thing to do.
With the Australian dollar being so strong,
Mm,
and like I think it was like 1 to maybe 70 cents USD now, that this has been like one of the highest foreign exchange currency rates that we have seen. I would
yep.
have thought that that would have absorbed to a certain degree the need for a rate increase because of that strong Australian dollar, in that sense. But I think also because of the unemployment has actually came down to 4.1%, which was surprisingly strong. But then again, when I think about the unemployment numbers, to be honest, it's a bit like, you're setting your own rule and you're playing the game as
Yeah.
well, right? Like you're classifying people being employed, even if they're just working on a part-time basis, or even just let's say doing a couple hours a week.
Yep.
You that's still being classified as employed as per se. So, to me, that's kind of like you're doing the exam and you're marking your own answers at the same time. You manipulate these data in order to give everyone or the general public a rational answer to say, well, this is what we're doing, and because of X, Y, Z, but because they mark their own answers, so therefore it all looks reasonable. But is unemployment really that low at the moment? I have to say, I think the reality is a different story, and I just fear this 0.25% or 25 basis point has a much more mentality impact than the actual material cash flow impact because for a 500K mortgage, that's only like $90 a month extra. Not, I mean, yeah, like maybe
Mm,
less Uber Eats 1 or 2 meal a month, or even 1 meal a month, to be honest. But more of a mentality, and that's going to hurt the small businesses, which is already struggling in Australia at the moment, especially the retail sector, especially the food, the restaurant sector kind of thing is already struggling a lot right now. And that's just going to make it even more difficult. So I'm concerned about the insolvencies in terms of the small businesses
yes.
in the next few months. I reckon we need to watch that carefully, or RBA needs to watch it carefully because ultimately, the cash rate is going to have a lot more psychological impact
Mm,
in terms of people's hiring decisions. And from my understanding, private sector's hiring isn't actually that high. It's the public
correct.
sector's that's
Correct.
that's the one that's holding all
Yeah.
the boat.
Yeah, which is really just printing inflation and calling it job
Exactly.
creation, right? Um, yeah, I haven't believed an unemployment number since the NDIS was rolled out, and I know that sounds kind of cheeky, but that's where they're hiding unemployed people. So and I'm not saying that claims are legitimate or otherwise, but I'm saying that it's another program that takes people out of the labor force because you can't have an unemployment rate so low as like 3.5 to 4% and still be as unproductive as we are. So we have a productivity problem. But if everyone's working, why would we be unproductive? And the answer is that they're either not working, but not claiming unemployment, NDIS, or that they are working, but they're not producing any goods or services, public sector. And so you can have full employment and be and be extremely unproductive. And the ultimate sort of example of this is where the Russians, the Soviets, used to laugh at the Americans in the 1930s during the Great Depression because we Russians, we have full employment, but you'd need to line up around the corner to get a loaf of bread because no one was making bread. And so it doesn't it's not useful to have everyone employed if you don't have any bread. Do you know,
Yeah,
and we're,
it's a pretty
obviously
big
we're not
issue.
that extreme, but Australia has that problem. Everyone has a job, but no one's making anything. And it's a little bit like a softer version of that sort of Soviet hubris that eventually got unwound later that century.
Mm, mm. Yeah. So, oh look, that makes a lot more sense, I guess, if you're looking at it from that way. It is one of those concerning things that I do think I don't know what the impact of this rate rise is going to be. But it's not much of a hit pocket money as per se, but more of a psychological type
Yeah,
of impact to the rest of 2026. Because our GDP is completely based on immigrants coming into the country and spending. So it's not really based on productivity nowadays, as
correct.
per
Yeah,
se, and that's the main issue. So
but but on the property market, all I would say is uh, the system needs property prices to rise. The reason for that is that when property prices rise, everyone gets paid back then in nominal terms. So lenders get paid back when you have rising property prices. So we generally speaking, the system wants rising property prices. I would say that the last time we had steep interest rate increases was back in, I want to say 2023. Could be a year out, but property
yeah.
prices continue to rise then. So if property prices come back in any material way, they will, I'm sure, reverse course.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to see. Even with rate rises at the moment, they're still predicting, a softer growth this year, but it
Yep,
is still going to be
it's still
growing,
growth.
right? Yeah, it's still growth. So, okay. And that I think is a great segue in terms of talking about our key topics today. So, how can property prices keep rising when so many people really can't afford to buy? Right? So, you literally just touched on the government actually needs the property prices to continue to rise to a certain degree. But as an ordinary Australian today, let's say, someone's looking to purchase their own home in Sydney, for example, because, everyone's a lot of people are working in Sydney, a lot of people work in Melbourne, Brisbane, all these capital cities. Pretty much all the capital cities, had such a good run after COVID. Darwin's still having a run at the moment. We know that, but pretty much everyone's took their turns, right? I don't think pre-COVID you still get properties kind of around the 500K. Now it's pretty much a double, if not more
Yep.
than that. Yeah. So for major capital cities. So how can property prices just continue to rise like that? And when people just can't afford to buy in today's environment, right? That's one of the main things that we get asked a lot from our clients. It's like, will property prices continue to rise? I mean, unfortunately, the answer is yes. It will, because we are in an inflationary economy, is the way how
Yes,
it
well, that's
works,
it.
right? Ultimately, that's what it comes down
Yeah.
to. Um, but how can people afford it? I guess let's tackle it that way. And that's used because you're in Sydney, you're specialized in Sydney.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, this is something that you need to educate your clients when they come to you, to say, John, I want to buy a $1.5 million house, but I can't afford it. What can I do? What can I do?
The what can I do question. All right, that's two questions then. So, all right, why do prices keep rising? And um, the reason is because the reason is that we have an inflationary economy. We have since World War One. So the RBA might tighten rates, but they will still expand the currency supplies, the money supply they call it, by about 6 or 7%, and that's probably. And maybe they dial it back this year. Maybe we get 3% currency creation, and then we'll get 3% growth in property prices. Um, uh, that's the reason. And we talked about, well, like, why would they continue to expand the currency supply? And the reason is because governments have debts they need to pay off, and so the central bank gives them the money through the bond market, and the government pays their debts back. But in doing so, they've expanded the currency supply. How do we continue to afford it to buy property equally? Some people have a greater capacity than others, and so you do get some inequality in there. But the way to think about inflation is Zimbabweans couldn't afford to buy property. Property was going up at 30% a month in Zimbabwe, and yet, but who was buying it? It almost didn't matter. It was just a currency debasement. We don't have anything like 30% a month current property price increases, but when you debase your currency, that's the level of property price growth you're going to get. Now we have very mild currency debasement in Australia, but we'll still get we're st it's inflation. It's inflation. We call property, when your bread price doubles or the movie price doubles, they're consumer goods, so we call that inflation. But when the price of an asset goes up, we call that a capital gain. But it's not really a capital gain; it's just inflation, and
It's
no one's
inflation.
wealthier. Prices just go up. So the one thing that governments and central banks can do is affect prices through the amount of currency they create in the economy. That's why prices go up. No one's making. We shouldn't even tax capital gains. I'm sure you've heard me say all this before, so I'm gonna be quiet. But look, you know, just because Zimbabweans couldn't afford to buy property didn't mean prices still went up. They couldn't afford to buy bread, but bread prices doubled every day as well. So that's the malfeasance of of inflation. One thing I would say is that at the premium end, you do get a lot of Chinese buyers. Chinese buyers. I mean, I feel like a lot of that's probably like money cleansing, trying to get money out. But you don't see that you don't see that for the average like three-bedroom house. I think you see that more at the luxury
Prestige.
end.
Yeah,
Yeah.
luxury end, I say.
And
Yeah.
so, the question is like, who's affording the $20 million house? Well, there's a bit of international competition there as well.
Government's also trying to inflate the currency so they can actually print their way out of the debt they already get
That's
themselves
right.
into. So,
That's right. And
watering it down.
the longer we're in debt, the worse this is actually going to get. This doesn't get better, because then you need to print money to pay the interest. Um,
Mm.
so the question then becomes like what do you do about it? What do you do about it? And I think partly there's like a mindset issue, like how to think about real estate, and then partly there's expectation. So couple of observations on that. Firstly, I think we should think of real estate, particularly in capital cities like Sydney, as a luxury item, and not everyone's going to afford a luxury item in the same way that not everyone owns a BMW or a Bentley, and Sydney real estate, particularly in some parts of Sydney. It's a bit like owning property in London or Paris or New York. People in, Iowa don't grow up thinking they're going to buy a property in New York, because New York real estate is a luxury item and that's for other people. And while I don't think it's entirely true, but Sydney is our most international city, and it is probably healthy to think of a property in Sydney as a luxury item, and you're going to need to make some sacrifices to own it, unfortunately.
Especially
Um,
houses in Sydney, houses with
yeah,
land
totally.
in Sydney in
Yeah.
particular.
And actually, before we move on, what are your thoughts on that as a sort of it's a bit of a wet blanket, but what do you think of that as a concept that Sydney luxury item, you just adjust your expectations?
I do agree, John. I think I reckon that's probably the same for you. A lot of people come to us to ask for that, and especially aspiring new homeowners who want to purchase their first home in Sydney, they look at the prices, they were absolutely gobsmacked and shocked in terms of how expensive it is.
Yeah.
But then it comes down to a bit of a mindset and re-education to say, look, we didn't start buying properties right in, let's say, Rose Bay from day one, for example, right? Or
Yeah.
giving an
Yeah.
extreme example
Yeah.
in that sense. Or let's say Annandale, or Annandale, kind of inner west kind of area, right? Like
Yeah.
you couldn't afford to get into that from day dot.
Yep.
And you need to work your way through. And this. probably won't be just applying to Sydney. Sydney is the most expensive city of all Australia capitals, but with the way that all the prices are going, this will soon apply to Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth. Eventually, it's kind of all going that in that direction.
Yep.
But what most people need to understand is it's a step-by-step process. You and I, John, we didn't buy a three-bedroom home in, let's say, Annandale when we're in our 20s or 30s. We couldn't
Yeah,
afford
correct.
it either at that point. Same with our mum and dad. They wouldn't be able to tell you to say, look, we got there in one step. No, we always had to work our way through. So, maybe it's a way of buying into or living into Sydney through getting a townhouse first instead of getting a house or a big block of land where you want to live. You need to buy somewhere a bit more outskirt, at least get into the market, work your way, paying down the debt, let the capital growth do its job for a couple of years, and then slowly, slowly upsize your way through. We're the same position. You and I both live in two-bedder units initially when we started this. It's not like
Yep.
we went straight into a three-bedroom house like that. We work our way through units, then slowly upgrading townhouses, houses to eventually where you are today, and as
Mm,
well as location, right? You work your way in. So that's the same mentality for pretty much all Australians who want to be able to own a piece of real estate, which they can call their home moving forward. But Sydney in particular is drastically unaffordable in that sense because of the fact that there's a lot of international money that's also in the competition, like you mentioned before. A lot of prestige properties that's available, um, a lot of competition because of overseas buyers as well. That's in the mix. So you know, I think that's the expectation now, to say you're not going to be able to do it in one step. You're going to have to do it in multiple steps. So
yep.
find a path that you can get in first, and then eventually work your way up. And one thing that I think most people probably will ignore is the generational wealth that's going to come through as well. So those people, mum and dads who's got property, the Gen X's, let's put it that way, the Gen X's now who owns a piece of real estate or multiple pieces of real estate in Sydney, they are eventually going to pass that generational wealth onto their
Yeah.
kids as well or children as well, right?
Yeah.
And that's when they will then upsize to that level. So, someone might not be able to afford a John Moying house at the moment, but after that generational wealth transfer, they will be able to.
Yep.
But it will take time
True.
for that to come
Yep.
through
Yep.
as
And
well. Okay,
there's
so yeah,
still a lot of boomers around as well. No, I
correct.
totally agree. I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the way I look at it. I think it's a lot of mentality and educational piece, in the sense that what you earn today is not in proportion in terms of what you can afford.
Yeah.
But as long as you work through and you buy what you can afford today, and then you work your way upwards as time does its job.
Yeah, I mean the reason why your point about stepping stones is so important is, and that like you see someone living in a big house in the Lower North Shore now. I mean, you're really kind of skipping to their chapter 20. Really, you want
Exactly.
to see what they did in chapter one before you start to sort of assume that it was always easy. So stepping stones are important, but the other reason why stepping stones are important from not just from a mindset perspective, but from an economic perspective is if we accept that when we're buying real estate, we're playing the inflation game, right? The inflation game is that actually things aren't really getting more valuable, but they are going up in price because of inflation. So, inflation being a cumulative phenomenon, you want to start as early as you can. So, waiting to buy a house in Annandale when you turn 40 doesn't make sense because of the inflation game. What you want to do is buy the two-bedroom unit in Ashfield or whatever it is, and then allow that to appreciate. And while it won't buy you a house in Annandale, if you do it two or three times, you'll have equity, and then you can start to be a little bit more exploratory and a little bit more creative. Inflation's a cumulative process, so you got to start early.
100%. And that's why we're always advocating in terms of getting into the market early, in terms of
Yep.
what you can afford, rather than try to wait for the market. And, like there's so many talks, there's always going to be people talking about property market coming crashing down. There will always be
Yep.
people like that. We heard that for 20 years or 20
Yeah.
plus years, and we still haven't seen it happening at the moment. So,
Yeah.
I think the supply demand imbalance, unfortunately, is the reality. As much as everyone wants to live in a prestige suburb, in a nice home in a Sydney, nice suburb, You're not going to be able to do it from day dot. You have to work your way through multiple steps. And you're absolutely right. Don't compare your chapter one with other people's chapter 20.
Yeah.
That's a lot of hard work and put into there.
Yeah.
Um, so yes, I think that really is the crux of the issue. The property gain is the inflation gain at the end of the day. And you can't afford to buy it from day dot, but eventually, as you work your way through, pay down the debt, have a bit of equity, then you'll be able to step into that dream home of yours. A lot of our clients are doing the same, right? They're basically their ultimate goal is to be able to have their dream home, and whether that's in Sydney, whether that's in Gold Coast, whether that's in Sunshine Coast, anywhere, right? That's up to them to decide.
Mm,
But they use they buy properties where that's going to maximize their growth potential and then eventually be able to sell it off, have a big chunk of deposit to be able to then get into their dream home. So, I've seen multiple success stories with people doing that.
yeah.
And that's a great example of how you can afford it, not through day dot, but through accumulating good, appreciable assets.
Yes.
Properties as one of them, not just properties, okay, but property is one of them that will appreciate long term, and then eventually be able to sell it off, and then use that as a good down payment. Same thing with a lot of families who's wanting to basically accumulate a bit of wealth or be able to fast track paying down their home
Yeah.
loan as well. Investment property is a great way to do that too. So anyway, circling back, I think I digressed a little bit. Circling back in terms of the question, it is an educational piece, and at the same time, it's also an economical piece, as you pointed out.
Yeah. And just final point from me would be about making good decisions as well. So, life is about trade-offs. So, our parents who did, I think it was easier for them to buy they'll complain about 20% interest rates, but I think broadly speaking, it was easier for someone on a single income to buy a family house, and it may not have been flashy, but 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 what these people who were able to get into the property market early were doing, our parents' generation, they weren't getting Uber Eats, they weren't eating out very much. They probably had a rundown car, and so if getting into property is important to you, and I think it should be important to you, particularly playing the inflation game, make better decisions. Maybe don't eat at home, save some money, and the, if we sort of compare our standard of living to a couple of generations before, we may have lower home ownership than they did, but we also have kind of more of luxury. We can call and get a Lux delivered to our door in 15 minutes and McDonald's ice cream delivered to it. So we live better than our parents did in a lot of ways, but maybe the price of that is that we don't own real estate as early as they did.
I guess it comes down to that saving that deposit initially,
Yeah,
right? And that's been one of the biggest challenges in terms on the hurdles for people to be able to get in. Um, you need to be a good money manager in order to be able to
yeah,
get into property. That's end of story. That's what
yeah,
it comes down to. Do your budgeting, basically try to save as much as you can. And I know, like, I've worked with a lot of young aspired property investors. They are great savers. Like,
yeah.
they know their goals and they want to basically get there. So I think it comes down to if your goal is strong enough to be able to get into property in 2026, and it's a great time because we're literally just past the new year. Hopefully, everyone's New Year resolution is
Yeah.
still there and still working towards it. But if your goal is strong enough to wanting to get a property in 2026, then yeah, make sure that you obviously budget well and then you look after your money and then have a decent amount of savings because this year I think there will be some great opportunities. With rate rises at the moment, a lot of people's mentality is like, that's a back and wait. So in comparison to last year, I reckon this year, at the moment, people's mentality will be like, well, rate's going to go up potentially one more time this year, later this year. I'm just going to sit back and see how it plays out, which means there'll be less demand, which means there'll be less
Mm.
competition. So it's actually not a bad idea if you are ready to look at properties in 2026. And I reckon that might be another topic that we can touch on as well.
Yeah. 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 Let's do one on timing for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's pretty much all for today. Anything else you want to add, John?
Nothing for me.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us again today. And yeah, Hope everyone's looking after their money and still keeping afloat with their New Year resolutions. But otherwise, we'll see you guys again in another episode of Spark Your Fire. Cheers, John and David.